Well, let me intro our panelists here, just in case you wanted to know who was watching what. Um, Kathleen Lappe, do you say Lappe or Lappe? It's Lappe, right?
Latte, yeah.
Just check, Lappe. Okay, otherwise known as Katie, is the CEO of DirectOffer. Liz Sturrock, I expect most people know, is the chief of the MLS and innovation for Miami. And Nathan is Brannen, also very pretty well known as the CPO of Restb. Thank you all for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. I do curate my panels pretty carefully to hope that people are knowledgeable about the topic, that it's meaningful to them. So I've actually had separate conversations with each of these people about AI, and they all had something to bring to the table. This is not, I'll give my standard disclaimer that the masterclass, this masterclass, any of my masterclasses, and this one is Innovation Meets Regulation, AI, Real Estate, and Fair Housing Laws, just a short topic, is not an infomercial. I don't like that. We all hope that you use local logic. I'm quite sure I'll manage to plug it in there somewhere. But generically speaking, this is not an infomercial. We're here to learn together and have a real discourse. And I like to say that every time because candidly, it's really important to me. Okay, so first we're going to talk about AI. And we're going to start with, generically our familiarity with AI. What is AI, right? I think what I'd like to do is go around with the panel and say, like, how do you think of AI in terms of what it relates to? And we are going to try and keep this real estate focused, right? In terms of what it relates to what we do every day and what we know about it. And then we'll kind of dig into some of, I'll go into a little bit about the Biden order and the new EU order. I am not an expert, so I will speak at a very surface level. So, Liz, you want to kick us off on sort of,
Oh, thank you.
I know I'm going to jump around. There's no predictability here.
Yeah, I mean, AI is, it's one of those things that's been around for a while, but it's only really been in the general public's hands now for a year. And so let's talk about it in the general public's hands for a year mindset, which is how can our realtors boots on the ground use AI today? And that is content generation, whether it is images, whether it's blog posts, whether it's social. That's what we're focusing on for the most part. And then, along with images, obviously goes virtual staging, decluttering, those things that we see every day right now. And that's because it's easy to use and easy and approachable for our members. We just want to help them do it safely.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. You want to go, Nathan? I'll save you for last, Katie.
Yeah. So for us, we've been playing with AI. That's the core of the company, mainly related to understanding imagery and trying to automate and structure that data at scale. And it's been interesting because historically, the way you worked with AI is you had a very good understanding of what was used to train the model. And then, a little over a year ago when ChatGPT came out and large language models became, the buzzword of 2023, it was really interesting because they could do things that almost seem magical, but it was also a lot harder to understand exactly the limits of what they could do because you don't know exactly what they've been trained on, as they've essentially been trained on everything. So I think it's been, and this, this session in particular talks a lot about, what are the challenges and what do you need to understand to work with something that's so new and exciting, but also not quite as controlled as things in the past.
Okay, thank you. Katie?
I love going last. Well, for us, we've really focused on the language models, language learning models. And when you're working with those in sort of like an AI powered for multi-language overview of properties, engaging experience for consumers and agents, and how to take those language models with your artificial intelligence and have it work with the translation models. So it stays within what I call the bumpers of not hallucinating, and works within what is acceptable in our language model in the United States, as well as overseas. Certain words we can't use, certain words that are not translatable, like the word listing is not translatable. When you read what comes across, let's say MLS, and you put it into a cognitive story through using your AI technology, you have to make sure that it still defines the intent of what was translated through the MLS or the real estate listing itself. so complex when you are dealing with several languages in several countries, because what makes sense here doesn't always make sense here, and you have to find that defining middle area.
Perfect. And I think that dovetails really nicely into talking about what AI is really. And AI, I always feel like people make it seem like almost like it reminds me, and unfortunately just old enough to remember, like certainly talking about the cloud and sort of our understanding. Now we sort of take our understanding of the cloud for granted, right? But typically in the beginning, when the cloud of data storage, people are like, what do you mean it's in the cloud? It's over there. And I feel like AI is really very similar in terms of people who aren't in tech really understanding it. And it really is just a repository of information and a program that crawls through that repository of information, and then interprets that information. And the only reason that people, that really has existed for a long time, the only reason that people are nervous about it is because it learns. And that's the part where it gets very, robotish, and it's learning as it goes. More information it feeds, and it's able to sort of to learn as it goes. And that's what scares us, right? And in fact, I was reading up on this a little bit last night, and there was a great comment that most people don't realize that his estimate is AI, right? It takes in information from a variety of sources, it crawls through, right? And as new information is fed into it, and they're algorithms, folks. An algorithm is a mathematical calculation, okay? It says to his estimate, I put X percentage of weight, meaning like emphasis, on comps. I put this percentage on taxes. I put this percentage on actives and sold, blah, blah, blah. And that's it. And the company, Zillow, and this is nothing derogatory, determines those weights. But as they basically measure it against what the property sold for, they are able to learn and improve the quality of that AVM. Okay, so just so we understand for context, this is an example of how it affects real estate today. Now, we had two acts come out legislatively recently. One was Biden, right? The act, and the other was the EU came out this week. And I wanted to talk a little bit about your guys' understanding of that. My understanding of reading Biden, it was super surface, and it didn't really relate to real estate. It will, but it was just really a very surface legislation that says, hey, everybody needs to be responsible about this. The EU one, interestingly enough, and I was just looking at it, is much more specific and has a lot to do with biometrics, and is really much more concerned with scraping and things like that. Now, this comes into a different point that I'll throw over to you guys. If it's funny that the EU one mentions scraping, because I was like, oh, scraping, right? I mean, we're in real estate. Scraping is we know scraping. If we're building AI algorithms that are scraping data, to Katie's point, one might be different in terms of interpretation for language. What does that really mean in terms of like what kind of data we're putting into the algorithm? And I apologize, I actually don't think it's on the prep, and I'll get to fair housing in a second. But are you fearful of what goes into these algorithms in terms of like whether you, Liz, are with an MLS, the source of truth? Are you fearful of that? And how do we protect ourselves against the data that feeds the machine?
I think fearful is a strong word. I mean,
Okay,
we advise everybody, and I talk about this all the time, you need to review. You are responsible for whatever you publish. So if I pull something, whether it is from the paper Encyclopedia Britannica or ChatGPT, I am responsible for the accuracy of what comes out of there. And so if I am not literally checking the sources, sure, you can ask ChatGPT to cite sources. You can ask it to cite legal cases. It will make those up. We all know this. So I tell people, if you want it to write neighborhood descriptions about a neighborhood you're pretty familiar with, and you just don't feel like writing the prose, it's an excellent tool for that. If you would like it to do a diatribe on mold remediation, I think that you should fact check that and say, I'm not an expert, but here's a good place to start. And it really all goes to the core of what are you doing with it? How critical is this? But, we've all read the story of the lawyer who had cases made up, presented them to the judge, and the judge laughed him out of the courtroom. So no one wants to be that person. So do not be the face of that idiocy.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because it's funny, what I was thinking while you were saying that? How often do we Google something and we ask Google, hey, Google, what is the population of Miami, right? And we assume that because I always call it the Goracle, feel free to steal it. But we assume that the Oracle knows. We're not actually recognizing that it's simply crawling through its data sources and giving you the one that's probably been Googled the most, not necessarily because it is fact checking it and going to some data source that it considers preeminent. So I don't know, Nathan, if you want to, dovetail off that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's Liz kind of put it well. You just have to be aware of this. This isn't, a lazy card. It's an efficiency card that still requires that final human touch. But I mean, I think the other thing that's relevant is, well, what happens when the data is accurate? And one of the things that came out in the recent Biden AI order was talking about algorithmic discrimination. And so what happens when you have a bunch of historical data that's been impacted by discriminatory practices such as redlining that now is feeding models to predict prices in the future? And that is something where even if the AI is using the data correctly, you still need to understand, okay, how is that data being used? And how can we make sure that it's not perpetuating biases that we're looking to get rid of? And so it's, there's no one size fits all solution. And you actually have to handle kind of both of those scenarios of what happens when the data is wrong, but what happens when the data is right, but we need to, eliminate why it, ended up at that value in the past.
Right. We need to be better. And so that's one. I sit on the NAR Federal Technology Policy Committee, and that is really what we focused on. We focused on AI, and one of our work groups is committed to recommendations around DEI and fair housing. So we know appraisals have come in incorrectly for African-American families and African-American owned homes. We know that lending has certainly absolutely skewed. NPR blew that open. The San Francisco Chronicle blew that open, 3 years ago? All of those were built on algorithms. And so obviously we need to be better, right? We need to be better than history. And what our recommendation is that tests need to be put in place and the algorithms need to be constantly back tested because they're constantly going to get updated.
Right.
And to ensure that fair appraisals, fair AVMs, fair lending is all in place.
We'll get to fair housing in a minute, and I'm going to switch to you, Katie. I know you've got a comment. Again, I think that's what the Biden Act is really about. It's about basically sort of a federal mandate to accuracy in effect, so that you can't, impugn or mislead consumers. Go ahead, Katie.
So sort of to lean in what Liz was talking about, landlords are increasingly looking at AI to screen prospective tenants, and the prevalence of incorrect, outdated, or misleading information in such reports, it increased the cost and the barriers to housing, especially among people of color. So being very transparent in AI and responsive and ethical is the crust of Biden's presidential executive order.
Let's, by the way, quick public service announcement. Please feel free to write questions in if they're coming up, and just jot them in the Q&A section. So if you have questions, I will wait till the end, but I just throw them in there. If you don't have any, we must be doing a good job. Okay, so for fair housing, let's move over to fair housing for a minute. I don't know. I am probably just enough to be dangerous, but who wants to talk a little bit about fair housing, and then we'll talk about how it intersects specifically with AI. Anybody want to go first? Oh, geez. Wow. Okay. Go ahead, Liz.
I want to take over the conversation. So
no, you're okay. I will cut you off. I promise if you do.
So one way we're helping address it, and obviously this is just scratching the surface here, is in the products that we have partnered with. We have worked with those vendors to ensure, I call them the 10 words you can't say on television. All those words you cannot say that will get you absolutely dinged and tested for fair housing don't show up in anything that comes out. And so we partnered with Chocolate Chip AI, which is a wrapper for ChatGPT 4, and Nyla June, who has their own large language model that they built that does listing descriptions in a TurboTax-like interface. Love both of those products. We were very upfront with them that we wanted these protections for our members. Obviously, our members are liable for everything that they put out there themselves. We are just trying to build the guardrails as well as we can. And the vendors are very open to that because it improves their value proposition.
Yeah, okay, good. And I don't even want to ask you what the words are. So I get it. And I know Roof is another ChatGPT provider, and they do a very good job with it as well. Nathan, do you want to go?
Yeah, so I think when we look at, fair housing, it's you want to prevent any type of discrimination against, race, sex, color, religion, anything that shouldn't be a factor when it comes to renting
Right.
a home, buying a home, or, getting a mortgage on a home. And that can be, the simple things as using the 10 words you're not supposed to use, but it can also be a lot more tangible things of, oh, my home got appraised for, a quarter less than it should have, and now I can't afford the home that I was hoping to buy. And so it's something that I think sometimes gets trivialized, because a lot of the things that are top of mind now are, okay, they used words that aren't appropriate in a description, and maybe I
That's
don't even agree that it's that big of a deal. But the larger idea is like, okay, it's someone not being able to buy the home that an equivalent person would be able to buy just because their skin's a different color. And I think that's the whole point behind this rule, and why it's so important to be aware of what can happen to allow this to occur, and what can we do to also use these new technologies to prevent that, or to help minimize the impact of things that have historically happened much more than they should have.
on it, but it does raise the ruling. It does raise the question of who decides, right? It's sort of like, remember when Har first came out and said you can't use the word master for master bedroom, was the first one to kind of go out there and say it's not okay. And I think, it's kind of like who takes that stand, who makes that decision, right? So I think it can get tricky and messy. And I'm glad Liz is on NAR on that task force. Katie, can you talk about this a little bit? I know, and I know I'm gonna let you go on this a little bit on the W3C, because this is near and dear to your heart, and about disabilities. We're talking a lot about people of color, but what about disabilities and such?
Yeah, so we really focus on breaking down the barriers to home ownership. My daughter is autistic. She's actually graduating from college with her associate's degree
Congratulations. Very cool.
Saturday.
Mhm.
It's a huge accomplishment, because when you have a child with a disability, you never know if they're going to go to college or if they're going to achieve. So we're very fortunate. But what I noticed when I started looking at listings with my daughter is that she started getting really frustrated. And that's when I kind of went on this mission of, you know what, we need to break down the barriers to home ownership, make it easy for whether you're able or disabled to be able to look at our real estate listings and understand them completely. Like text messaging, that was built for people that are deaf. Most people don't realize that. We all use it. And so breaking down the barriers of home ownership is really creating technology that people are not aware is built as equally for people with disabilities, whether they've got hearing disabilities, visual disabilities, or language barriers. And imagine having a language barrier and having a disability. That's frightening. So, by creating technology that is easily accessible for anyone able or disabled, that addresses all of these pain points, allows somebody to freely look at our real estate listings, converse with our agents, and gain home ownership, as opposed to just being frightened and not understanding what they're looking at or having the ability to.
I agree, and congratulations.
Thank you.
But I think for AI, how does AI play a role in that, to be honest? I mean, one of the things we
It,
talked about, I think, in our prep call was about captioning and things like that and things. So what's the positive and negative of that for people with disabilities on the short answer?
I'm sorry. So
No, no,
AI,
no, no, you're all right. I know
AI,
that's a long
yeah.
answer. That's a long question.
I know AI absolutely plays a massive role, because captioning, just basic caption readers, are not 100%. And what we have is, when you've got to lean on technology companies like ours, which does multilingual audio tours, or Restb.ai, that has actually built the technology that layers on top, that actually uses the AI for the proper translations, for the proper captioning. Those are the ways to go about it. Like Liz is partnering with all these wonderful companies to help her address this. So AI for captioning, yes, AI for language translation, AI that also helps connect to screen readers, braille readers, the tags that you use within the back end of our computer programming that explains it to the end user. I can go on and on about
Okay.
this.
Well, you opened the door so beautifully to Nathan. If he doesn't want to talk next, something's wrong with him. So, because his is all about visual interpretation. So I'll let you continue on that journey and plug away, Nathan, for Restb. Quickly.
Yeah.
Not too big a plug.
No, as Katie mentioned, I think if you are someone who is visually impaired, you can't interact with a property in the same way that someone who can see the photos of that property. And that's, that's a big limitation to making things as equally accessible as they can be. And so a solution that we put out was to, automatically generate captions for all of the images that are on a property. And it's something that in a perfect world, you could say, all right, the agent's going to do that for every property, but all right, 25, 30, 50 photos of property, who knows how many properties being uploaded every day to get an entire website that knows that there's going to be descriptive text behind each image. It's just not, there's not a really viable path to that without technology like AI. And so it's a big thing that we've done partnering with MLS is to make sure that all of that can be populated. So someone who is interacting in a particular market knows that every property that they're looking at, they can have those photos described in a way that allows them to understand and interact with that property in a way that they couldn't before.
Okay, now I have a big question for you though. Okay. And this is my chance to do my 5-second plug, which is Local Logic does have like neighborhood reports and a lot of also like what we call neighborhood insights, right? Whether they're widgets or APIs, or we have a report coming out in the first of the year. And one thing, and I certainly say it because we offer it, but because also we are very careful with the language surrounding that, right? Because it is interpretive. So for instance, if people tend to be sensitive to a word like poor or something like that, right? So my question to you a little bit is, how do you make sure that when you're describing a property based on sort of, again, this goes back to his estimate, based to an algorithm and your decision of what the picture looks like as it being a kitchen, or are you so broad, like we're very careful, or are you so broad that you just try and you don't have a lot of problems because it's like so accepted? Do you understand the question? I think you do probably.
Yeah. So, I mean, fortunately, we had this solution out before a lot of the LLMs and things came out like that. And so we have a lot more control over what is being done because we spent so much time building that out. If you do use, say, ChatGPT to caption photos, you can end up with things that are more problematic in the same way that you do with listing descriptions. But to your point, it's a balance between saying, hey, let's create the most expansive, unique, variable way to describe every photo, and saying, okay, let's create something that really gets to the point and allows someone reading it to understand without some of the risk that you're talking about as you start saying, okay, who's the one to judge if it's a poor condition? I mean, there's a lot of subjectivity that you can avoid with how you program.
What you're really saying is we're always going to need a human a little bit. I mean, it's funny. I was at a sports game, and they have the new, I hate to, like the Amazon Fresh kind of thing, right? Where you can buy all the drinks, they're all in cabinets, and it's like technically you're not supposed to need any human interaction, except there's a human there. It's just like the grocery store self-checkout. Those people are so busy because technology at some point requires some level of a higher intellectual guardrail, right? That's the point of the legislation. Liz, I wanted to dovetail to you a little bit also about something we talked again in the prep call about the brokers and the MLSs getting demand letters on accessibility and fair housing issues with regard to AI. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Right. So, I mean, obviously anybody can sue anybody for anything.
Well, there's that. Then there's that.
And this is not legal advice, but yes, we've had brokers and MLSs we've seen demand letters come not just for accessibility, with it being a public space, which that's been around for a while, but also for fair housing for disability. NAR was very helpful in getting a lot of those shut down when that happened about a few years ago. But we, of course, took a hard look at all of our websites and said, are they as compliant as can be? Right. And so then we depended on companies like Restb. W3C has obviously done a really good job about putting out standards, but none of those have really passed case law yet. And there's no federal guidelines around accessibility for websites. So what we have chosen to do is basically partner with the companies that make sense to show that we are making our best efforts to make everything that we offer as accessible as possible to the consumers and to our members. So whether that is closed captioning for classes, whether that is partnering with Lundy so that you can find homes via voice, whether Restb, which tags all of our photos, and we also use for compliance. There's lots of tools that can be done there. And then, just the standard things that you can do on your website, right? So always having alt text available, always having all the text to be resizable. We want to make sure that we are as accessible as possible, and that will give us the best defense that's available today. And that's a constantly evolving landscape.
That's an excellent answer. Katie, I don't know if you have anything on that, if you want to jump in. Otherwise, I'm going to move to appraisals in case you want to talk about appraisals.
Well, let's talk about how AI can contribute to fair housing practices.
Good.
And you can use AI to analyze housing patterns and trends that can identify and address inequalities in housing opportunities. And it helps us make better decisions sometimes in that direction.
Like predictive, in terms of like predictive analytics. But I do want to go back to appraisals, because this is something that came up in the prep call that I started reading about, but I was not aware of how much AI is being used in, if you Google like AI in real estate, it was interesting to me where it's really playing its role. Okay, agents are using it to write descriptions of properties, right? It's crawling through photos like with Restb, all the stuff we might expect and probably is manageable, right? But really, I guess with the desktop appraisals, right? We are in effect phasing out appraisers. And then, and I guess it's a question of, does that worry anybody? I'll go around the room. Does that worry anybody that somebody is not driving by the house and taking a picture? Or do we feel like, look, it was here's the counterpoint to it. I don't have an opinion, that it was an algorithm all along, and we were really just paying a guy to take a picture of the house to validate that what was on, to Nathan's point, that what was in the database was actually true, right? So I'll go to you, Liz, first.
So I'm gonna quote the Greg Robertson here, which is Zillow can't smell the cat, right? Zillow can't. A desktop appraisal cannot tell you that.
Well, you just got me a plug on Vendor Alley. Thank you.
It can't tell you if the basement is musty, right? Sure, my basement has a waterproofing system in it, but in the really rainy season, it still gets a little musty down here, no matter how much I run the dehumidifier. Those types of things,
it's true. That's exactly the point.
Until you are there, and that's what you need an appraiser to be able to see, because they're going to be able to dig beyond just a heat camera and a LiDAR measurement. That yes, anybody can do. So you still need a human. Now, does it need to be a fully licensed and trained appraiser who has a couple thousand hours of apprenticeship? Well, that's a good question. And that's not for me to say, but you still need a human.
Well, what's interesting though, I will say, do you need a human if the actual whether or not the cat smells, and I bought a house with a stinky cat basement, so I understand this very well. If that's 10% of the algorithm, because the truth of it is that in SFR, right, single families, and in the as more and more institutional investors are coming in and purchasing homes, they are like, that's 1% of our value. We don't care because we can fix the stinky cat. So I'll move to Nathan if he has an opinion on that, and then Katie.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you're always going to have the best results with a human and an AI working together, and 1 + 1 = 3 in this case. But to your point, Audrey, there is a big push to say, okay, when do we need to have someone go out to a site and do a full appraisal? When is a desktop appraisal okay? Because, we're looking at a cookie cutter home where 250 homes are the same, and 10 of those have been sold in the past 60 days.
Exactly.
And, this AI is a way that, provides more flexibility on what that price is and how that can be scaled out. But the other thing that I think is really important with AI that we've seen is that, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and Fannie Mae was talking about them finding issues where they've started using AI in their review process. And they're saying, this has been reviewed 6 times before it's gotten to us. How are we still finding errors in this appraisal? It's reviewed, once that data is collected, it's reviewed by the AMC, it's reviewed by the lender. And so how are these issues still getting there? And the reason they're still passing through is because the manual reviews that are in place and the things that are in place are not catching things that can exist. And there's a lot of reasons, mainly time and effort it takes to catch these things, that are causing that. The other thing that we've seen is that there's a lot of subjective elements, even if you want to take the subjectivity out of a home, mainly related to the condition and quality of properties and the comparables that are being used against them. At the same time, we looked at, market analysis of things like days on market and sale price and said, well, simply seeing that the sky is overcast in the listing photos can increase days on market by 12 days. So if you have these things that, you looking at a home would say, oh, I'm not accounting for the sky when I'm determining how much this home is worth, yet the data says that this is impacting how I see that. Those are very important things to realize when you're looking at, all right, someone's gone and visited this home. Were they having a bad day? Was there something that happened that, with that looks at the other properties they compared, says, hey, something's out of whack here, and we want to, a second look at this before it's already gone to the lender, already gone to the GSE, and, basically become a bigger problem for everyone in that process.
Yeah, I think it's funny. In effect, you're bringing in that this is a great point, counterpoint, and I'll see what Katie thinks. But what you're really saying is that the human element can be detrimental as well, in effect. And it's funny because think of the impact that it's had being able to place furniture and do virtual staging. I mean, virtual staging, I believe, having bought and sold a bunch of homes last year, is massive, absolutely massive. And that is in many ways what you might say is the perfect combination of technology and a human element. But in effect, to your point, the agent is virtually staging it. But it makes a huge difference seeing an empty room as to where you might put your furniture, right? It impacts the consumer dramatically. Katie, I'll pass to you for an opinion.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot that's going to change with AI and appraisals, because now we have the ability to see how, the area is impacted by weather conditions, how what the property was like years ago and how it was developed, and how the owners came about. Almost like you order a Carfax for your car. We kind of can get a more broader image of the history of the home, which is phenomenal. And then when agents use AI for staging, I think that's wonderful and everything, but there's absolutely a line that we've got to watch, because when you're looking at real estate listings online, and if they overstage it with too much AI, and if the consumer goes to the house, it's falsely representing the property.
Oh,
We
yeah,
can't
there.
have that. We really can't have that. So
Yeah.
honestly, you need to have a truth photo and an after photo, giving them an idea what it's going to look like, or at least let the consumer.
I don't know. Do you though? I mean, that's
You should. You
you
should.
should, and
You
hence the
should.
legislation. But that almost brings us full circle as to where we are with AI and fair housing is coulda, shoulda, woulda, right? In essence, as we have more institutional money in real estate, it's all going to be about what moves the needle fastest. So let me ask. I do have a good question that came in again. Please ask questions as you need. I'm going to raise one more topic and then we'll go to the question. Leads. Let's give everybody a bone for who stayed on the whole time, which is leads are. I read this great little piece last night about leads and AI, and about how one thing that AI will do for agents and brokers, maybe not for MLSs per se, Liz, I don't know, maybe, is crawl through such a massive database. So, okay, I go visit a home. I know that you see that I'm visiting the home based on my cookie, right? But I don't know that it's been reported into an agent that I bought a home recently, sold a home recently, how much money I make, whether or not I applied for a mortgage, whether my credit rating is right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that came up in some of the articles I was reading is what an impact AI is going to have on sort of and I'm not going to go too much into predictive analytics specifically for CRE, Katie, because that's a different topic for a different time, but specifically for residential leads. Any opinions on that? Nathan, I'll start with you this time.
I mean,
I know this is my curveball, by the way.
I think a lot of it's already happening already. You have companies that are looking at life events to understand, okay, did someone just get married, get a promotion, get a new job?
Exactly.
To do that. And I think as more data is available,
does the consumer know though? Does the consumer know?
I mean, I don't think the consumer knows, but I don't think they know in the same way for retail, for anything they see on Instagram.
Fair point.
The optimist take that I would have is imagine that AI is determined that, you have a 2-story modern townhome that, in a typical month, let's say that's 3 of those are available and sold, but for whatever reason, there's been none of those on the market in the past 3 months, and you're a homeowner who has that home, and if an agent can reach out and say, hey, based on just the current supply demand of your particular market, we think you could get 15% over whatever you think the value of your home would be in a normal market. Are you now more open to selling? And this is something that, may not be attractive to a lot of people, but would certainly be interesting to some people. And, anything that can ultimately increase liquidity and, help people get better value for the home for what that market is there for. I think there's certainly at least a conversation, if not a good outcome of having that type of efficiency created by AI and more technology.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, we've had buy scores and sell scores for a long time based on properties, not necessarily on consumers.
Mhm.
But so we're part owners of Remind. Most people know that Remind has had that for a long time, and I still think it is the best in class, where it marries that marketing database, the consumer database, along with the property information. And whether it's marriage, kids going to college, divorces, babies, etc., along and ties that in with equity, those algorithms are what sell that sell score, and that is really the best lead gen that's out there based on those today. But that's going to grow where it goes back to and starts tracing. I'm sure some of the big portals are already working on it and tracing that for people actually looking at properties on websites.
Yeah, they definitely are. Go ahead, Katie.
We've actually been collecting this data for a really, really, really long time. So not to date myself, but if you go back like 10 years ago, I used to do mailings at the post office, and I'd be able to pick streets that had the median income of the people living on the streets.
Sure,
It told me
right.
the income of them. So this is actually not really new, but we've tracked what people make, where they've moved, what their house is worth compared to what their net worth is, and whether they be perfect to sell, to upgrade their home. And this data is available.
Well, it's true. And Local Logic really, I got a comment in, and then I'm going to close and go to the question. But one of the comments in on the conversation log is, the environment is a big influence as well, and that is something. I'm glad he wrote it. I did not write it. Is that we actually do try and focus on the neighborhood and the environment, and Local Logic is all about everything outside the four walls. We step outside, so it's true that, and I do think like people are more focused on that increasingly, like. To your point, you can change the house, you can fix the house, you can get rid of the stinky cat, but can you get rid of your stinky neighbors? We try and kind of give people some understanding of that, of what is meaningful to you in terms of where you live. Let me go to the question because I think it's a good one, and then we'll wrap up and give everybody a little time back. But where do you think ultimately AI will land with copyright, and how will that impact things like ownership of listings and MLS data and photos? I think I'm going to send this to Liz. I know it's a toughie. Do you want me to repeat it?
The answer is I don't know, and I won't.
Okay. Well, anyway, have a good day.
I'm not even going to get
everybody.
off the crystal ball on this. I mean, when it comes down to it, what we do is we encourage all of our agents and brokers to use photographers that are in our preferred photographer program.
Yeah.
Again, we modeled this on what NAR recommended. So they own their own copyrights. That means that they get to defend their own copyrights. So if they want to start going after AI to do that, listen, we understand that. That said, it means a lot of the genie's out of the bottle. So where this lands, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it goes to that scraping question. Do you guys, Katie or Nathan, have a comment on this? Or we can just, if you want to steer clear of that one, that's understandable. It's a tricky one. Nathan, I feel like maybe for you specifically, because it does tie into Restb pretty directly.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, particularly working globally and seeing what happens when, there's a balance between, okay, wanting access to data, but also wanting to reward the people whose data that is. And I think the MLSs obviously, have done a ton of work and provide, in my opinion, the most high quality data set anywhere we see in the world by a very healthy margin. And the idea that, particularly with these new technologies, that they can just be crawling the internet and returning any of that at a whim without any type of compensation is certainly a concern. And I would love to see something that kind of protects where they fit, because if you don't have any incentive for the MLS to do all the hard work they do of standardizing, collecting, and making that data available in an easy to use format, you end up with just, I mean, it's so difficult to do anything in these other markets because that data set doesn't exist.
That's the whole point of RESO,
because it's not going to be that same quality if there's no incentive to to
To
maintain it.
regulate.
And the tech companies need the data, right? I mean, but they are training systems. You know, I've talked to a company that does virtual staging and virtual decluttering. And I mean, they asked me, they're like, can we use your photos? And I said, hey, I really can't. I don't have the license to do what you want to do. But I think it's something that we're going to need to consider because, again, it goes back to garbage in, garbage out. And the AIs really need the regionality as well of what those photos look like, whether it's the sky, the sun, light coming through the windows, and then obviously the styles of the properties. There's huge value in that, in us doing that today. But the way, you know, the way these licensing agreements work today, you know, I can't do it.
Yeah.
So I think it's something that needs to be considered.
Yeah, we used to write it into the agreements when I was running the stuff, like, you know, about scraping and all of that. And I don't know, to me, Katie, I'll let you have the last word if you have one, but otherwise I'll just say this. It reminds me of like if you're having a big event and you don't use their caterer, right? You know, you pick their caterers for a reason, right? I mean, maybe it's a light example, but it just makes me think that, you know, you do have to trust your member organization. Because in essence, at some point, then I won't say they're liable, sorry, Liz, but they're certainly holding themselves responsible by recommending the way business is done. Katie, I don't know if you have one last word on it.
I just think we're going into unknown waters.
Yeah.
And we are going to have to lean on being more regulated, more transparent, who owns the data that's being augmented, how is it being augmented, ownership of, you know, whom it belongs to when it's presented, and letting people know who it belonged to and where the origin of the data was from. So we're going to see a lot of mapping and tracking going on with data like you've never seen before. And for companies like ours, it's super important for us to stay on top of that to make sure that we are accountable for that, whether it's our AI regulations in the US or overseas.
Or local, or through our members,
local.
or through our member organizations.
Exactly.
I think that is actually a perfect summary. See, you nailed it, girl. That was outstanding because I think this all comes down to, if you learn anything from this webinar, it's about the origin of the data, right? And tracking it and watching it for accuracy. It is going to be our responsibility. It's no different than your consumer data when you buy something and reading in T&Cs. So perhaps it will force us all to be a little more vigilant, both as part of the organization we are and as consumers. Thank you, everybody, for joining. That was really it. We know that our panelists have calls to go to. I have calls to go to. You have calls to go to. Have a fabulous holiday season, and we will see you at the next masterclass in January.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.